Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the heaviest, densest, and most consequential sources and distill them down into the pure insight you need. Today, we are taking on, well, the human soul itself.
We really are.
We're using excerpts from one of the most profound and frankly terrifying works of literature ever written, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
It is truly a deep dive into the abyss, and our mission today is, it's a complex one. This isn't just a book report, not at all. We are tracing the psychological descent of Rodion Raskolnikov.
Right.
He's a man driven by this intense intellectual fervor and at the same time this crushing social misery to try and live out a terrifying philosophical idea.
The idea of the extraordinary man.
Exactly. We're going to follow the chronology of it. We'll look at the suffocating environment that birthed his theory, the clumsy, brutal reality of the crime itself, and then the excruciating psychological traps that are set. And they're not really set by a detective.
No, not really. They're set by his own conscience.
Yeah.
By guilt. And to truly grasp the monumental weight of Dostoevsky's focus on suffering, we have to start not with the character, but with the author. Many people know he was a serious literary figure, but his ability to write about the agony of the condemned, well, it was forged in a trauma so severe it irrevocably changed his mind.
That is absolutely essential context. You can't understand this book without it. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested and condemned to death. This was under the severe autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas's spate.
And his crime was political.
Entirely. He had participated in conversations against censorship, he'd read a politically charged letter aloud, and he knew about a plan to set up an unlicensed printing press. I mean, by today's standards it seems mild, but back then.
These were considered revolutionary acts.
They were.
So just imagine the scene. He spent 8 months locked up in a fortress, totally uncertain of his fate, only to be taken out one morning to Semyonovsky Square. He and the other condemned men, they were members of the Petrushevsky Circle. They were forced to put on these white shirts.
The shirts worn by those about to be executed. They were bound in threes to the stakes, facing the firing squad. Dostoevsky later recounted that his mind was just racing, calculating that he had maybe minutes left to live.
What a horrifying thought.
He reflected on the vastness of the universe, the total triviality of his own life, and just the sheer agony of the certainty of impending death.
And then, when the psychological torture was at its absolute peak, a sudden reprieve.
Right. The sentence was commuted to hard labor in Siberia, but the psychological damage was already done. It was complete and instantaneous. We have reliable accounts that one of the other prisoners, a man named Grigoriev, went instantly and irrevocably mad the moment he was untied from the stake.
Just snapped.
Completely. He never recovered his sanity. So Dostoevsky understood, viscerally, the awful agony of the condemned man. The whole point of that mock execution wasn't just to punish. It was designed to inflict the maximum possible psychological torture.
And that experience, followed by 4 grueling years of penal servitude in Siberia, that became the foundation of his work.
Yes. When he wrote about Raskolnikov's mental turmoil, the guilt, the intense fear of discovery, he wasn't just theorizing about literature. He was reliving a personal, physical, and mental catastrophe.
That sets the stage perfectly. The intense suffering that Dostoevsky lived through informs every single detail of the squalor and the moral depravity of the St. Petersburg we're about to enter. We're going to analyze how that real-world cruelty convinces Raskolnikov that radical violent action is, in his mind, the only escape. Okay, let's unpack this environment. When we first meet Raskolnikov, he's not just poor, it's more than that. He's in a state of self-imposed, almost feverish quarantine.
That's a great way to put it.
He is living, by his own telling, in a narrow hole in that awful little cupboard. A room so small the ceiling is literally pressing down on him. He hasn't seen anyone, or wanted to, for weeks.
His poverty is acute, yes, but his emotional and intellectual isolation is even worse. He's described as enduring a whole month of concentrated wretchedness and gloomy excitement. He's an intellectual who is just drowning in filth.
And he's in a state of monomania.
Total, almost pathological concentration on a single, terrifying idea.
It's interesting how Dostoevsky emphasizes the sensory details of his detachment from the world. He's so focused on his theory that the simple, necessary functions of life are agonizing to him. The sight of a servant girl, or just the necessity of eating, makes him writhe with nervous irritation.
Yeah.
He's so divorced from reality that he hasn't even registered that his landlady, who he owes money to, had stopped sending him meals 2 weeks prior. He's running on pure, toxic intellectual energy.
And this squalor, this filth, it isn't just atmospheric dressing, it's the justification for everything that comes next. The entire city of Petersburg, especially the parts he lives in, is this pressure cooker of disease, stench, and desperation.
He needs to see it. He needs proof.
He needs a perfect specimen of failure to confirm his belief that the system is rotten and that only violence can cut through that rot, and that specimen arrives in the form of Marmeladov, the retired clerk.
Tell us about Marmeladov. He's the immediate, visceral reality of the social catastrophe that Raskolnikov is contemplating transcending.
We meet Marmeladov in a tavern, and it's a suffocating, foul-smelling place, the stench of cheap drink and stale human bodies. He is over 50, and every single physical detail just screams failure.
It's all there in the description.
His face is bloated from ceaseless drinking. It's described as having a yellowish, even a greenish tinge, and yet his keen reddish eyes still have this gleam of something like madness, or maybe just the last flickering trace of self-awareness.
And he's trying to hold on to one last shred of dignity.
He is. It's the hopelessly ragged black dress coat with only a single button desperately clinging to the fabric.
That detail about the single button is just gutting. It really is. It highlights his futile attempt to maintain the appearance of his former station. And his story is, well, it's a painful narrative of a cycle of drinking and utter destitution. And it's all drained by his wife, Katerina Ivanovna.
Katerina Ivanovna is equally tragic. She's described as slim, graceful, and terribly emaciated, and she has that hectic flush in her cheeks.
A classic literary indicator of consumption, of tuberculosis.
Absolutely. She's a woman who is just being consumed by her pride and her desperation. She's a former noblewoman who has been reduced to total destitution, living in a communal room with 3 starving children.
And the domestic tragedy is profound. Marmeladov shares this horrifying detail about her sheer frustration. He says when the children cry, even from hunger, she instantly falls to beating them.
It's not malice.
No, it's the definition of a desperate, fractured maternal instinct driven to the absolute point of breaking by impossible conditions.
But the apex of this tragedy, the ultimate sacrifice, is Sonia, Marmeladov's daughter. We learn about her descent into the streets to earn money for the family. Marmeladov reveals that Katerina Ivanovna, driven mad by the children's hunger and her own crippling pride, had sarcastically encouraged it.
She taunted Sonia.
Yes, she taunted her. You are something mighty precious to be so careful of.
That moment, Katerina Ivanovna's simultaneous encouragement and then her subsequent complex shame, it just shows the total moral collapse of the household. Sonia sacrifices herself and Marmeladov, the very man she is saving.
Immediately betrays her, yes. He confesses to Raskolnikov right there in the tavern that he had taken Sonia's last 30 kopecks, all she had managed to earn, and he is currently drinking it away.
The 30 kopecks. That detail makes the cruelty so intimate and real. It's not about grand corruption. It's about the grinding, intimate, destructive power of poverty on the human spirit.
And yet, Marmeladov finds a strange, almost perverse relief in this public humiliation, he says. It hurts more. It hurts more when they don't blame.
He wants to be judged.
He wants to be judged because judgment confirms he still exists and is accountable for something. He recognizes his own moral depravity, but this public confession is his twisted form of seeking grace.
And his final, desperate question encapsulates the entire ideological problem Raskolnikov is wrestling with. Marmeladov looks right at him and asks, "Do you understand, sir? Do you understand what it means when you have absolutely nowhere to turn?"
Nowhere to turn.
That environment, that absolute lack of moral or physical escape, it confirms Raskolnikov's conviction. The world is broken, he thinks. Existing laws only serve to crush the weak, like Marmeladov, or elevate the contemptible, like the pawnbroker. Marmeladov's story is the ideological fuel.
Precisely. Raskolnikov sees that the laws of man and the laws of God have both failed this family. This entire section sets the necessary context. A world so ugly and so desperate that a radical young mind can convince itself that a single violent transgression is not just justifiable, but in fact, morally required.
This brings us directly to the intellectual foundation of the entire deep dive, Raskolnikov's theory. It's later articulated as a published article he wrote, and it attempts to provide a logic for the ultimate crime. Let's break down the chilling simplicity of the extraordinary man theory.
The theory is, it's essentially a radical, self-serving individualism that's been disguised as social progress. Raskolnikov posits that humanity is neatly divided into 2 types, the ordinary and the extraordinary.
And the distinction is absolute. The ordinary men, the vast majority of people, they must live in submission, obeying the existing laws and traditions. They are, in his view, the breeding material.
The conservative mass that preserves the current order, they have no right to transgress.
But the extraordinary men, the true originators, the great legislators, thinking of like Kyrgyz, Solon, or crucially Napoleon, these men have an inner right.
An inner right to overstep certain obstacles. And those obstacles are the established laws and moral codes. If the transgression, even murder, is essential for the practical fulfillment of their world-changing idea, then they are permitted to commit it.
Okay, but wait. If the theory is so clearly self-serving, why does he bother with the caveat that the transgression must be for the benefit of humanity? Is that Dostoevsky trying to save his protagonist from being a pure psychopath? Or is Raskolnikov just trying to lie to himself?
It's the essential self-deception that makes the theory so dangerous. I think it's the latter. He has to cloak his personal ambition in a cloak of utilitarianism.
Right.
The phrase benefit of humanity is the intellectual currency he uses to pay off his own conscience. He's telling himself he's a modern-day Napoleon, capable of sacrificing a few lives for the good of millions, and he justifies it through what he calls simple arithmetic.
Let's analyze that arithmetic because it's the immediate justification for the crime. He focuses on the victim, Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker, and he calculates. He actually says, kill her, take her money, and with the help of it, devote oneself to the service of humanity and the good of all. What do you think? Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds?
The calculation is chilling because it completely strips the victim of her humanity. He assesses her worth based purely on her social function. She is a sickly, stupid, ill-natured old woman who is sucking the life out of poor people.
So in his mind, her life has negative value.
Exactly. Raskolnikov decides her life is no more than the life of a louse, of a black beetle, less in fact. If you can quantify moral worth like that, the crime becomes a moral necessity, not a transgression.
So the intellectual framework is sealed. He believes his reason and his will are strong enough to withstand the reality of the act. He prepares with this manic, feverish focus, boasting to himself that his design was not a crime.
But the moment of execution immediately destroys his clean theory.
The chasm between theory and reality is Dostoevsky's central point, isn't it?
It is. Raskolnikov arrives, feverish and panicking, and his great reason fails him immediately. He is hyper-focused on totally irrelevant, abstract thoughts. The psychological state of men on the scaffold, the benefits of fountains in city squares, anything but the practical details of the crime.
And the mechanics of the crime are absurdly clumsy. He forgets to fasten the door securely with the hook from the inside. He's so wrapped up in the intellectual justification that he commits blunder after blunder.
And the ultimate failure, of course, the one that completely destroys the math, is the introduction of a second unintended victim, Lizaveta. She arrives back at the flat unexpectedly. If Raskolnikov's arithmetic was truly simple, one life for many good deeds, then her death is the algebraic error that collapses the entire equation. She was the pawnbroker's half-sister, described as a simple, thoroughly crushed and scared soul.
Pregnant, too, and utterly harmless.
And he kills her accidentally, though with the same axe. We are told she was so simple and crushed that she did not even raise a hand to guard her face.
So why does this second accidental murder ruin the entire philosophical premise? I mean, even if the primary victim was deemed a louse.
Because the arithmetic only works when the agent is perfectly rational, detached, and in complete control of all the variables. Lizaveta proved his irrationality and introduced human frailty, his frailty, into the equation. She was not a louse. She was a victim of the same oppressive environment that Raskolnikov claimed to be fighting against.
So by killing the harmless Lizaveta,
he proved he was not a transcendent lawgiver like Napoleon, but merely a panicked, clumsy, ordinary murderer.
and the final piece of this ideological betrayal happens much later, during his confession to Sonia. He admits the initial utilitarian motive was all a lie.
Yes, he finally tells the truth.
He didn't do it for charity or for wealth, he says. I wanted to find out then and quickly whether I was a louse like everybody else or a man. The murder was a personal experiment in status, a test to see if he was above morality. And by his subsequent breakdown and the clumsiness of killing Lizaveta, he failed that test miserably.
He finds that his theory, which was based on cold logic and calculation, it cannot survive contact with human reality. His body, his mind, and his conscience immediately revolted. The intellectual superiority he staked his whole life on immediately dissolves into fever and panic.
The moment Raskolnikov's grand theory fails, his physical and mental state just immediately collapses. He leaves the scene in a dreadful chill, experiencing violent shivering. His mind, the very tool he used to justify the crime, turns against him.
It becomes his enemy.
He feels that all his faculties, even memory and the simplest power of reflection, were failing him.
And his actions after the crime are just textbook failure. He frantically and unsuccessfully tries to destroy the evidence, stuffing the stolen items, a few trinkets he barely even remembers taking into a hole under the wallpaper. And immediately, the small, rational part of his brain pipes up and says, "Is that the way to hide things?"
He's not thinking clearly at all.
Not at all. He is afflicted by this acute infectious illness. He wakes up in a feverish sleep, horrified that he didn't even latch his door, and he spends hours just searching his clothes, turning everything over to the last threads and rags. This is the anti-Napoleon.
And this sickness and paranoia lead him straight to his first crucial error. He receives a summons to the police office.
And he's convinced it's about the murder.
Of course, he stumbles there in terror. But it turns out the summons is merely about a petty debt for 115 rubles to his landlady.
The instantaneous psychological swing is dramatic. When he realizes it's not the murder, he feels this intense, indescribable relief. So potent it acts like a toxic shock. And then the physical betrayal, while he's overhearing two police officers casually discussing the details of the murder. He faints.
Head away.
Right on the floor of the police station.
That fainting fit is Dostoevsky's brilliant move. It is a loud physical declaration of guilt that immediately alerts the authorities, turning an ordinary debtor into a primary suspect. And this is when we introduce the true genius of the novel.
The master psychologist.
The examining lawyer, Porfiry Petrovich.
Porfiry is not a traditional detective. He's not focused on fingerprints or blood spatters. He is a philosophical antagonist. He doesn't need physical evidence. He needs Raskolnikov's mind.
He understands Raskolnikov better than Raskolnikov understands himself.
He does, and he plans to extract a confession through pure mental torture and exhaustion.
Their first meeting is a masterpiece of passive aggression. Porfiry immediately brings up Raskolnikov's published article about the right to crime, pretending to be confused or curious about it. He's just drawing Raskolnikov into an intellectual debate when Raskolnikov is already half mad with fever.
And Porfiry's strategy is so sophisticated and patient. He avoids an early arrest because he knows premature imprisonment might actually give the suspect moral support.
It would allow him to retreat into his shell.
Exactly. To stabilize his mental state, prepare his legal defense. Porfiry wants the pressure cooker on full blast. He wants Raskolnikov to confess not out of legal necessity, but out of a complete psychological and intellectual surrender. He is waiting for a mathematically clear proof, which in Raskolnikov's case means absolute self-betrayal.
He uses ambiguity like a weapon, constantly switching his tone. He's jovial one moment, deeply philosophical the next, and then he just casually drops an unsettling little detail. He tells Raskolnikov that rumors are flying, that his friends Razumihin and Zametov are discussing his fainting and his strange behavior, just to watch Raskolnikov squirm and try to intellectually override his panic.
And he repeatedly, subtly displays the specific damning knowledge. He mentions Raskolnikov's bizarre behavior in a restaurant before the crime, blurting out loud that the pawnbroker should be killed. He points out the unnatural, hypocritical nature of Raskolnikov's nervous laughter when they're discussing the murder itself. He's just chipping away, bit by bit, at Raskolnikov's facade of composure.
But the detail that utterly breaks Raskolnikov is the one that Porfiry drops at the climax of their mental sparring. It's a detail that proves Porfiry knew Raskolnikov had returned to the crime scene days after the murder.
Driven by his sickness and paranoia to experience the site of his transgression.
Right. And what does Porfiry say?
Porfiry reveals that he knows Raskolnikov went to take a flat at night when it was dark and how you rang the bell and asked about the blood. This was Raskolnikov's deeply private, desperate, compulsive act of returning to the scene of the crime and trying to gain access under a false pretense.
It's pure mental compulsion.
It is. And knowing Porfiry has, this means his internal fortress, his carefully constructed sense of intellectual superiority, has been completely breached.
He is trapped, not by a physical clue, but by a psychological observation. Porfiry recognizes that Raskolnikov's greatest shame isn't the murder itself, but the realization that he was a clumsy, predictable, and ultimately ordinary criminal.
Porfiry is waiting for the intellectual submission before the legal one. He's forcing Raskolnikov to admit that he failed his own theory, and this is why this section is the intellectual heart of the book. The law, embodied by Porfiry, doesn't need force. It needs patience. It allows Raskolnikov's own mind, poisoned by guilt and pride, to become his own executioner.
So as Raskolnikov is disintegrating under Porfiry's mental pressure, the external world continues to press in on him, primarily through his sister Dunya. Her economic desperation has brought her into contact with a series of truly toxic men.
Which brings us to the first antagonist, Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin, Dunya's fiancé.
Eugene.
Luzhin is the very embodiment of the calculated, small-minded egoist. He's a middle-aged, newly wealthy man, driven entirely by self-admiration and the money he has managed to amass. He views his impending marriage to Dunya not as a union of affection, but as a carefully calculated form of social and financial control.
He has this core belief about how marriage should function, which he reveals with, just breathtaking arrogance. He wanted a wife who was a beggar, someone who had experienced deprivation and why, so that he could perpetually feel superior, have complete control over her, and always reproach her with your being her benefactor.
He wanted a beautiful, clever slave.
A slave who would worship him for lifting her out of the muck.
And Raskolnikov, despite his fever and his murderous guilt, he sees this cruelty instantly and is just disgusted by it. The inevitable explosive confrontation occurs in Raskolnikov's tiny room, and it leads to Raskolnikov laying down the ultimatum to his sister. It is me, or Luzhin.
And Raskolnikov is correct about Luzhin's motives. When he's exposed, Luzhin turns crimson, not just with anger, but with confusion. His carefully constructed image as the generous benefactor is shattered.
And he's summarily dismissed. He leaves with this profound, vindictive hatred, convinced that Raskolnikov, the poor, arrogant student, alone ruined his perfect plan for marital servitude.
So if Luzhin represents calculating, petty ambition, then the second major antagonist, Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, represents something far more terrifying.
A total depraved nihilism backed by immense wealth.
Yes, Svidrigailov is genuinely sinister. He's a figure cloaked in dark rumors, and Dostoevsky gives us just enough detail to confirm his moral bankruptcy. He's widely accused of systematic persecution, leading to the suicide of his servant, Philip,
who hanged himself due to Svidrigailov's relentless psychological cruelty and mockery.
And even more disturbing is the widely accepted story of a deaf and dumb 14-year-old relative who died by suicide after Svidrigailov had allegedly outraged her.
And it took the massive money and social exertions of his deceased wife, Marfa Petrovna, to stop that story from ever reaching the police. He's a man who seems to exist purely to cause suffering.
Yet, and this is where he becomes so complex, despite this darkness, Svidrigailov exhibits these strange, unsettling acts of generosity. He offers Dunya 10,000 rubles, which is a massive sum, to break her engagement,
claiming a desire to do some good to offset the harm he had caused her and her family while Dunya was working for him as a governess.
And his generosity extends to Raskolnikov's family as well. The 3,000 rubles Dunya inherited in Marfa Petrovna's will is facilitated by Svidrigailov, and Raskolnikov immediately demands his mother use it for Marmeladov's funeral expenses.
He facilitates Raskolnikov's first act of genuine, uncalculated charity. It's a total contradiction.
So his actions can be good, but his philosophy is rotten. He believes he lives most gaily who knows best how to deceive himself.
It's an admission that happiness is found only in ignoring objective moral reality. He doesn't seek redemption. He seeks distraction and transient pleasure.
That cynicism is clearest when Raskolnikov questions him about his marriage plans. Svidrigailov cheerfully admits he's about to marry a girl, barely 16, who he calls an unopened bud.
He finds a massive disparity in age and development fascinating and delicious, purely because she is unformed and easily manipulated.
He even tries to excuse his past brutal behavior toward Dunya, which involved forcing himself upon her when she was his governess, by claiming it was an act of frenzy brought on by her scorching gaze. He blames the victim, using these elaborate psychological excuses for his total moral abdication.
So in short, you have Luzhin, who attempts to control Dunya through money and petty superiority, seeking validation. And then you have Svidrigailov, who tries to buy his way into happiness, or at least out of responsibility, and seeks stimulation through depravity. Both are expressions of the extraordinary man concept, twisted to purely selfish ends.
And they show Raskolnikov that his philosophy, once it's actually applied in the real world, simply creates more suffering and more moral chaos.
Absolutely.
The scene quickly shifts back to the sheer devastation left by Marmeladov's death after he was run over by a carriage. Katerina Ivanovna channels her devastation into this escalating spiral of madness and pride.
And she takes Raskolnikov's donation, the money Svidrigailov facilitated, and wastes it on a lavish, pretentious funeral dinner.
The dinner's just tragicomic. It's her final, desperate attempt at theatrical dignity. She tries to prove she was raised in a genteel, she might almost say aristocratic colonel's family. She uses the dinner to loudly put down her landlady, Amalia Ivanovna, claiming she would never have been allowed into her father's kitchen.
It's a tragic display of intense, corrosive pride that's masking total, undeniable destitution.
And this chaos is the perfect stage for the peak of social cruelty, delivered by the scorned Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin. He's seeking final, vindictive revenge on Raskolnikov for ruining his engagement, and he carries out this devastating act of malice against the most vulnerable person present.
He plants a 100-ruble note on Sonia during the dinner and then loudly, dramatically accuses her of theft. This is a devastating moment. It confirms Luzhin's moral vileness. It shows that society, even the ordinary part Raskolnikov sought to protect, is utterly unforgiving and will always crush the vulnerable.
The irony is that Raskolnikov committed murder to stop such exploitation, but the exploitation just continues relentlessly around him.
And it is only thanks to Lebeziatnikov, his friend and former roommate, that Luzhin's malice is exposed. Lebeziatnikov reveals he saw Luzhin furtively planting the note on Sonia to repay her for a previous small donation. The incident exposes the utter malice and self-serving nature of the very society Raskolnikov tried to transgress for.
And this brings us to Sonia, who stands in total moral contrast to Raskolnikov, to Luzhin, and to Svidrigailov. She is the symbol of selfless suffering and virtue.
She has committed a social sin by being forced into the streets, but she has maintained her spiritual purity.
She is gentle, humble, and she finds her strength in this profound, almost childlike faith. When Raskolnikov questions her about her future, she simply asks, "What should I be without God?"
Her faith is her life raft in the storm of Petersburg's depravity.
And Raskolnikov, the arrogant intellectual, is magnetically drawn to her. He needs her moral clarity. He attempts to test her, forcing her to read the story of Lazarus.
The dead man raised to life. Why that specific story?
Because it is the perfect metaphor for what Raskolnikov secretly desires. Resurrection. He is spiritually dead, entombed by his pride and his crime. He needs a miracle, a divine intervention, to be brought back to life, and he forces Sonia to read the passage that describes the moment Jesus calls Lazarus forth from the tomb.
It's the clearest foreshadowing of his own moral renewal, mediated through her faith.
The reading of Lazarus is the prelude to the confession. Raskolnikov, in a final attempt to connect their experiences, declares that Sonia, too, have transgressed, have destroyed a life. Your own, it's all the same. And he insists they must go the same road together.
He's trying to drag her down to his level to justify himself.
He is. And he finally reveals the truth. He is the murderer. He confesses he did it not for altruism, but to find out whether I was a louse like everybody else or a man. He is still agonizing over his intellectual status, not his moral crime.
And Sonia's reaction is the pivot of the entire novel. It is not judgment or condemnation.
Not at all.
It is immediate, agonizing sympathy. She falls to her knees, crying, and declares, "I'll follow you to Siberia." It is a pure, uncalculated, profoundly human response of love and compassion, the exact opposite of the arithmetic that drove Raskolnikov to the crime.
Let's contrast that moral purity with Svidrigailov's final agonizing act. Dunya confronts him, desperate to know if Raskolnikov is the murderer, and she has his own revolver. She fires and misses.
Svidrigailov is presented with his ultimate choice. Take Dunya by force or let her go. And he realizes Dunya cannot and will not love him. This realization, it hits his moral limit, a limit that even his profound cynicism couldn't prepare him for.
He drops the key.
He drops the key to his room, granting her freedom, asking the desperate question, "Then you don't love me?" And you can't, never.
But denial of love, the realization that he cannot buy or force a genuine human connection, is Svidrigailov's personal hell.
It is. He withdraws his arm, lets Dunya go, and later that night, after a final act of giving 15,000 rubles to his 16-year-old betrothed to save her from his influence, he commits suicide. He had bought his way out of every social and legal consequence, but he couldn't buy his way out of his own moral emptiness.
With Svidrigailov dead and Sonia's moral guidance now his only compass, Raskolnikov takes his final steps toward confession, though he is still in the state of profound apathy and self-loathing.
He is, and Sonia compels him to perform a public act of contrition, to go to the crossroads, bow down to the earth, and kiss that filthy earth.
He does it. He kneels down in the Haymarket, the very epicenter of the squalor that fueled his initial rage, and he kisses the filthy pavement with bliss and rapture. It is a moment of profound, mystical submission, a full surrender to human community and to the earth itself.
But the public reaction is immediately mundane and anticlimactic, isn't it? The crowd instantly misinterprets the act.
He's boozed, they say, or he's going to Jerusalem, brothers. His profound spiritual moment is rendered completely trivial by the ordinary, unthinking judgment of the crowd. This is Dostoevsky showing how difficult true, honest repentance is to convey to others.
And crucially, he sees Sonia. She's standing 50 paces away, hiding, watching him. Her presence is the only real witness to his moral submission. However, when he goes to formally confess at the police office, the old, stubborn, intellectual pride kicks back in.
He can't help himself.
His formal confession is a final, desperate lie to protect his failed theory. He attributes the crime to his poverty, his shallow and cowardly nature, and his desire to provide for his first steps in life with the 3,000 rubles he expected to get. He explicitly denies the philosophical motivation to the authorities.
He still can't admit that his idea was wrong. He only admits that he was poor and weak.
And Porfiry Petrovich, having kept his psychological word, offers no physical evidence against him. Raskolnikov's confession is considered an act of heartfelt repentance by the court, and due to extenuating circumstances, his hypochondriacal condition, his past good deeds like rescuing children from a fire, helping a fellow student, the verdict is merciful.
8 years penal servitude in the second class.
But the physical punishment is trivial compared to the psychological consequence. In prison, in the hard labor camp in Siberia, his true suffering is his wounded pride. He doesn't judge himself for the moral crime of killing another human being. He judges himself for the simple blunder of failing his theory.
This is the core paradox Dostoevsky wants us to understand. He still believes killing the pawnbroker was atonement for 40 sins, not a crime. His greatest torture is the impossible gulf that lies between him and all the other men in the prison.
They're common, straightforward criminals. And they look upon Raskolnikov, the intellectual, the theorist, as a different species. They look at him with distrust and hostility because they can sense his aloof, spiritual arrogance.
He cannot reconcile himself to being an ordinary failure. He judges himself not for the moral wrong he committed, but for failing to be a Napoleon.
For failing to be the truly extraordinary man who could commit the act without suffering a conscience, without the clumsiness of killing Elizaveta, and without the subsequent guilt that drove him to confess. He remains spiritually isolated, unable to truly connect with the simple moral truth that Sonia offered him.
That intellectual fortress only begins to crumble when he falls ill again in Siberia. The sources conclude with a final moment of hope in the epilogue. Raskolnikov finally breaks down and realizes he needs Sonia. That profound, simple realization.
That his inner life is fundamentally connected to human love and compassion, and not to intellectual theory.
That's the true beginning of his regeneration, a new story of great striving, great suffering.
It is the realization that morality isn't an equation you can solve with an axe. It is a profound, messy, and essential part of being human.
So what does this centuries-old Russian novel mean for you today? Dostoevsky's work is the ultimate deconstruction of the tension between radical intellectual justification and genuine human consequence. Raskolnikov attempted to apply simple arithmetic to human life.
And found that human nature, guilt, sickness, panic, and most powerfully love cannot be quantified or calculated?
It's a powerful statement that moral and legal consequences are perhaps less punishing than the internal suffering of a damaged ego. Raskolnikov tried to elevate himself beyond the moral constraints of humanity, but his very humanity, manifested through his illness, his shame, and his need for Sonia, dragged him right back down.
Dostoevsky suggests that true ethical weight lies in acceptance, not transcendence.
Here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. Raskolnikov's tragedy was thinking he was above the law, believing that his exceptional intellect exempted him from shared human morality. But his true, self-imposed prison was his pride, which prevented him from accepting the simple, uncalculated moral truth offered by Sonia until the very end.
Which leads to the question.
If his extraordinary man theory failed so miserably, what then constitutes true exceptionalism in human endeavor?
Is it the capacity to ignore morality for the sake of an idea, or is it the capacity to accept and live within the constraints of shared human suffering and moral responsibility? Perhaps the greatest human endeavor is not to prove you are above others, but to truly connect with them.
Ponder that as you go about your day. We invite you to consider the fine line between intellectual fervor and human depravity. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.